Well, hello everyone. So we have the one and only David Friedman. Actually, there are two David Friedmans. One of them, I think, was an ambassador to Israel or something. But the one and only David D. Friedman, who is an economist, author, legal theorist, and most prestigiously, a person who's previously appeared on this YouTube channel. Um, so yeah, we're going to be discussing various things. So the first question is, so in your assessment of the Austrians, you worry that the way that they do economics rests too much on a priori assumptions in the absence of empirical data. So the Austrians, they think we can derive economics without testing it against empirical evidence. And an example that you're fond of giving is in your first ever published econ paper, you had a theory about the size of nations, that nations would tend to be larger in order to mitigate against market failures where different states have incentives to do things that are not in the best interest of the states generally. And you say, in the first draft of the paper, it got rejected by Stiglitz because it didn't have an empirical test. So
Stigler, not Stiglitz.
Sorry, Stigler, yes. Both very impressive, but very different people. And then you came back and had an empirical test of it that turned out to be correct, and then it got published. But I think perhaps one could make a similar critique of your anarchism, because it seems like your belief in that anarchism is desirable. There are quite a few moving parts to it, including the idea that, for example, you would not get cartelization, that the size of the long run average cost curves for such firms would be such that you would not get monopolies, and that there would be enough people who would voluntarily sign up to do national defense. None of these seem to be empirically testable. And so what makes it so that you're pretty confident that anarchy would be able to be successful given the number of sort of things that we can't empirically test about this?
Yeah, well, to begin with, I'm not confident it would be successful. I spend a couple of chapters of my first book, at least in the third edition, discussing reasons it might fail. So what I'm doing is sketching out what it seems to me is a possible form of social organization. Societies could be organized, giving reasons why it might well work, but under some circumstances wouldn't, and reasons why if it did work, it would be superior to the available alternatives. So I think you're considerably overstating the strength of my claim. Going back for a moment, I'm not sure that any statement about the Austrians can be true, given the amount of variation. I have a very detailed criticism of one Austrian, Murray Rothbard, in something I've written, which is up on my webpage for people to look at. I've looked at some other things by other Austrians more recently. I suspect I still have disagreements, but I'm not sure you could get any statement of what defines Austrians, the difference between the Austrian school and other schools, that all Austrian economists would agree with. So that's a bit of an oversimplification. But I agree, it's nice if you have empirical tests, and I have a few empirical tests of elements of my theory, but they all involve things in some sense analogous to what I'm describing. So, for example, one of the many issues is whether rights enforcement agencies would fight or arbitrate. And we have a somewhat analogous case with U.S. auto insurance companies, because if you run into somebody and he has a different insurance company than yours, each company would like to believe it's the other company's client who's at fault. And they have the equivalent of fighting is litigating, taking the case to a court, which is expensive. But in fact, my understanding is that almost all of it is handled by essentially arbitration, by a set of fairly simple rules of thumb that all of them agree to, because each of them knows that if I don't agree to it this time, he won't agree to it next time, and they're how those are settled. To take a different case, we have a system somewhat analogous to mine in Saga period Iceland. It eventually broke down. It broke down from what you might think of as natural monopoly or cartelization. We're not really sure, but it took about 250 years to do so. So in that case, it looks as though under some circumstances, the system was stable for a long period of time, roughly as long as the US has existed, although something changed and it eventually became unstable. So I think we have some empirical evidence, but we certainly don't have enough to be confident. As you may know, Scott Alexander, who's a blogger I think highly of, wrote a friendly but critical review of my book. And the ending of his review was that he hoped that the system I described would be tried somewhere far from him. And I thought that was a perfectly reasonable comment, that one cannot predict with confidence how a different system of institutions will work. I offered reasons to think that it might well work well, but certainly nothing like a proof.
Yeah. So if the United States, for example, or some other country slowly phased out the government such that over the course of 30 years, it went from having a government to having no government, would you say that you're more than 50% confident that that would be an improvement?
You haven't specified enough. The question is, how does it happen? What's the environment it's in? Is there some other great power that's likely to try to spend large resources conquering it, and so forth? And all of those things are relevant. I would be much less optimistic for Estonia than for the US, for example, because Estonia happens to have a large neighbor who isn't very friendly and is much larger. But no, I think there's a reasonable chance. My guess is it would take more than 30 years. I think you're optimistic on that schedule. But I think there's a reasonable chance that if the U.S. gradually abolished its government and replaced it with other institutions, that it would be a workable system. But how great the odds are would depend very much on, the future is very hard to predict. Part of the point of my book, Future Imperfect, which was my next to most recent book, is that beyond a few decades, the future is radically uncertain. That I think I described at least 3 technological revolutions that could wipe out our species, one of which people have started worrying about now, namely AI. And there are other technological revolutions which would make the world better, but very, very different. So I think asking to predict such things is too optimistic. I think there is a reasonable chance that such a system would work, but that's about as much as I'm willing to say.
Okay. So you said you're a moral realist, but you're sort of perhaps the equivalent. You are to moral realism what a fideist is to God. You think that it's
with a what?
What
moral realism?
Yes.
With a what to God?
A fideist. So the fideists are the people who think that they believe in God, but they don't think that they can prove it, and they don't think that sort of through rational argument alone you can establish that it's more likely than not. And you don't think that you can rule out the evolutionary debunking argument. Right. In your review of Mike Huemer's book, Ethical Intuitionism, where he replies to the evolutionary debunking argument, and what he says is that it seems like evolution did not directly select for our moral beliefs. Instead, evolution selected for us having the ability to reason, and then this ability to reason allows us to figure out things like pain is bad and various other moral truths. And the evidence for this is the fact that it seems like our moral beliefs are not directly adaptive. If they were, what you would expect is that lots of people would be reproductive consequentialists, where they think one should just maximize the passing on of their genes. And it turns out that that's a belief that no one holds. This shows that it's sort of another process that resulted in our moral beliefs, which may not endanger its reliability.
But the problem is that morals aside, we've got a whole lot of hardwired characteristics that are not optimal under our present environment. If put aside morals, if evolution could do a perfect job of programming us, we wouldn't be using birth control. We wouldn't be spending resources on pets. This is an old argument that Dawkins made. I don't know if have you ever read The Selfish Gene?
I've not read The Selfish Gene.
Worth reading. But one of the points he makes is that there are science fiction stories where humans create robots and the robots then take over, then revolt. And he says it's happened, we're the robots. That is to say, our genes designed us for reproductive success. One of the ways in which they found they could improve our reproductive success is to make us more intelligent. Unfortunately for them, our intelligence made it possible to subvert their objectives in favor of our objectives. So I know one woman who has 6 children. So maybe she's producing as many children as she could plausibly produce and rear, although my guess is she could still have squeezed in one or two more. But almost nobody I know is acting as if he was trying to maximize his reproductive success, and that has nothing much to do with morality. That's because people like to do things other than spending all their time bearing and rearing kids. So given that, you don't have to explain the fact that our moral beliefs are not perfectly designed for reproductive success, that any more than the rest of us are. You say that our moral beliefs were designed for reproductive success in the environment we spent most of our species history in, with the constraint that the genes are not sort of a supercomputer that can do anything they like. They only have certain mechanisms available to control our behavior through the way that biology works. They can make us desire sex. They can make us get pleasure from sex. They can make us like little kids, but they can't keep us from also liking kittens, because kittens are sort of like little kids in relevant ways. They can't keep us from getting our sexual pleasure by means that don't produce offspring, and so forth. So it is a plausible account that we have been imperfectly optimized for our moral beliefs, just as we've been imperfectly optimized for everything else. So I don't think. No, I read Mike's book because his basic position is the same as mine, and I was hoping he could find better arguments for it than I could, but so far as I can tell, he can't.
Yeah, so so evolutionary debunking arguments are only a problem, pointing out that there's an evolutionary account of how we acquired some capacity. That's only a problem, and that only undermines the belief if you think that it's not truth tracking. So you wouldn't say that there's an evolutionary debunking account of our vision because there's an evolutionary benefit to our vision being reliable. Now it seems that there's a similar evolutionary.
But the fact that there's an evolutionary explanation for our vision is the debunking of the watchmaker argument for God. It doesn't prove the argument is wrong, but what the strongest argument for the existence of God prior to Darwin is that you observe these very carefully designed machines running around, humans and animals and such. If you find a watch on the beach, you deduce the existence of a watchmaker. When you find a very carefully engineered mouse, you conclude that there must exist somewhere a very, very intelligent and powerful being who designed the mouse. That's sort of the standard watchmaker argument for God. And the reason why Darwinian evolution clashes with religion is it doesn't disprove that, but it provides an alternative explanation of the data and therefore weakens the argument. And similarly, if you have an evolutionary explanation of why we have common moral beliefs, one explanation is there's a moral reality we're looking at. That's the moral realist position. Another explanation is that we evolved under reasonably similar circumstances, and those beliefs were programmed into us for reproductive success.
Right. But so if you think that there's an evolutionary benefit to being able to reason and to carefully reflect and to develop truth tracking beliefs, so the same capacities that allow us to figure out the moral reality also allow us to do economics and calculus, then it seems like if that's the account, which it seems like we have some good reason to think it is, given our ability to kind of carefully reflect on morality, given the trends in morality over time, then it seems like that serves to vindicate it for the same reason that our ability to reason about calculus serves to vindicate rather than debunk calculus.
Except that when we're reasoning at most things, our ultimate basis is observations of physical reality. And the critical question is, are our moral intuitions that we're reasoning about observations of moral reality, or are they illusions of some sort? And that, if you can read a good novel and you say, aha, I can do reasoning about it. I have been. Even the only things, when I started writing a sequel to my first novel that never got finished, one of the things I figured out with my reason was who the father was of one of the major secondary characters. That was not information I put into it, but that was information that I deduced from the parts of the story that I had written. And similarly, in other cases, I've done calculation on the demographics of Naomi Novik's Scholomance world, which demonstrate that it's not internally consistent world building, unfortunately. Those very good stories. So you can reason about lots of things that aren't real. And if it's the case, just after all, people did a whole lot of reasoning about theology back before Darwin. That doesn't tell us whether there's a God or not. It just tells us that given some body of data, in this case, things like the Bible, people can use their reason to figure out the implications of those things, whether or not they're true.
Right. So I agree that the fact that we can, once we have initial principles, that the fact that we can reason about them and put them into consistency, that doesn't show that it's ultimately based on rationality where we figure out the things in the first place. And it's also true that there are lots of things that are lots of cases of reasoning about the physical world, but there also seem to be lots of cases where we are able to reason about things where we trust our beliefs in them that are not reasoning about them. My favorite example of this is modal facts. So modal facts are facts about what is possible and necessary. When a person claims things like that married bachelors are impossible, they're not claiming that based on the fact that when they observe the physical world, they've never seen a married bachelor. They're observing this, they're figuring this out based on the fact that they're able to reason. And when you reflect on what a married bachelor would be, you realize that it's impossible. It seems that in a similar way, when a person reflects on, pain or on causing, gratuitous torture, that they can, in a similar way, realize that it's wrong because they're.
I don't see that. The fact that a married bachelor is impossible is a description of what the words mean. But the word pain, your pain, the fact that we call something your pain, you might argue that part of the implication is you don't like it. But that doesn't have an implication that I don't like your pain. I might be a sadist and enjoy your pain.
I don't agree that when we say married bachelors are impossible, that's a fact about the definitions of words. What the definition of a bachelor is someone who's unmarried. But the claim that a person cannot be both married and unmarried is only true if we accept the law of non-contradiction as a necessary truth, which I do because it seems very obvious that it's a necessary truth. But the claims about what exists in reality, about whether things can simultaneously be and not be something, are not claims that follow from the definitions of words. Even if we...
Well, I think the definition of... I don't know about the definition. I think the definition of unmarried is not married. And if you're not married, you're not married. That's what the words mean.
Yes, but it is a further substantive claim that a person cannot be simultaneously married and not married. Now, I think it's a very obvious claim, but I don't know how you...
It's a description of what the word not means.
Well, but you could imagine someone who agrees with what the word not
you
means.
You could imagine a society where people are allowed to be married 6 months of the year, where you have a marriage contract which says that for the first 6 months of the year, I will interact with you as your husband and you as my wife. For the next 6 months, we're both single and we then go back. So you could call that married and not married, except that what we mean by married is all married, and what we mean by not married is all not married. So it seems to me that you're just making statements about words mean, not using your reason to get any additional information.
Well, okay. Well, so I disagree with the claim about modality, but there seem to be other examples. For example, that modus ponens is a legitimate inference rule. That if you have an argument in the form if P then Q, P therefore Q, that will always have a conclusion follow from the premises. That's not true in virtue of the meanings of words. That's true in virtue of facts about logic that we can grasp because we're able to reason.
But I'm not sure how that gets you to moral realism.
Well, the claim is just that if you think that our ability to reason about things explains our moral beliefs, and that this is a truth tracking process, then the evolutionary account of how we get our moral beliefs is we get good at reasoning and then we reason about the moral beliefs. That's not a debunking account any more than it debunks your beliefs about economics.
No, but I have not seen any evidence at all that one can, in fact, with no moral premises, get any moral conclusions. I don't see how reasoning about morality without the moral intuitions that you are normally reasoning from, or if you prefer the Bibles or some other source of moral information, is going to get you anywhere.
I agree that you cannot get moral conclusions without moral premises, just as you cannot get conclusions about logic from premises that don't explicitly invoke that rule of logic. But nonetheless, we still say that through reason, you can arrive at the conclusion that modus ponens is necessarily a valid inference rule. And we can arrive at that even though...
but I'm not interested in philosophy. I want to know how you derive that torturing small children is bad.
Well, the way
without
you
any
derive
moral
it,
facts.
The way you derive... So you don't derive it without any moral facts. What you do is you think about it and you conclude...
Where do you get your moral facts from?
Well, you reason about them. You think about them. And you...
Where do you get them from? You can't think about them unless you have them.
Well, you have concepts of what pain is, and you have concepts of what it means for something to be wrong. And then you think about what pain is, and you conclude that the property of wrongness applies to the act of inflicting pain on others for no good reason.
I just don't see how you're going to engage in that reasoning.
Well, so if you don't think the reasoning works in that case, why do you trust the reason in the case of trusting modus ponens? In both cases, there's a thing that you accept because it seems intuitively very obvious. And so if you don't...
See, intuitively very obvious sounds an awful lot like my intuitionism.
Well, no, I agree with your intuitionism.
I don't see any logical connection between inflicting pain and being wrong.
Yes, I'm also an intuitionist. My claim is that the intuitionist methodology is not killed by the evolutionary debunking arguments.
I understand. And what I'm saying is that if you believe that we have our moral intuitions because of evolutionary reasons, then that gives us no reason to think they're true. After all, we also have a desire for sweet things due to the fact, I gather, that ripe fruit in the environment we evolved in is good for us. And green fruit gives us stomach aches. Nowadays, we can satisfy that sweetness by having lots of sugar. It doesn't follow that sugar is good for us or even leads to reproductive success. So I don't see how the fact that that evolution gave us particular moral intuitions is any reason to believe they're true.
So it's not merely the fact that evolution gave it to us. The question is whether evolution gave it to us in a way that serves to vindicate it or in a way that serves to debunk it. And if you think that...
Not to debunk it, fails to vindicate it.
Yes, undermines our reason for believing it, while not necessarily showing that it's false.
Right.
Right. And if you think that the process that allows us to figure out the moral facts is the same process that allows us to figure out facts about economics and facts about...
But if you think that, if that's what you think, I want to see you do it.
Well, no. So there are differences between them in that, economics is in some way an empirical discipline. You arrive at it at facts by thinking about facts about the empirical world. But the broad methodology of thinking about what is true, seeing what things are obvious by reflecting on them, and trying to figure out what's right in a way that... So, if that's the methodology that we apply both to economics and to physics and to mathematics and to logic and to morality, then the mere fact that the mechanism comes from evolution does not seek to undermine it.
Except that evolution, when we were figuring out the general rules of logic, gave us a reason for finding things that were true about the real world. Because on the whole, though not always, believing false things is worse for your reproductive success than believing true things. On the other hand, it is not clear that believing true moral facts would be any better for your reproductive success than believing false moral facts. So unless the true morality is whatever increases your reproductive success, which I don't think anybody I know of believes, so I still don't see how you're getting anywhere.
Well, so it's also the case that understanding calculus had no benefit in the ancestral environment, but nonetheless, it came out of things that were beneficial in the ancestral environment. And so
Correct.
My claim is that our ability to reason and to apply things like consistency tests, where we see, we reflect on our own pain, we conclude that it's bad, we realize that other people's pain is relevantly like our own pain. And so we conclude that their
yes,
pain...
that means, but what I observe reflecting about my own pain is it's bad for me. I don't conclude that it's bad for you. And therefore, when I reflect on your pain, I say, yep, that's bad for him. It doesn't tell me whether it's bad for me.
Well, I think that it seems like if something is bad for someone, then it is bad, and the badness is directed at someone.
I don't understand that. If you are trying to kill me and I shoot you, my shooting you is bad for you and good for me, right? You're staying alive and healthy is good for you and bad for me.
Sure.
You're
So
doing a good job of shooting me. There's no particular reason why the fact that something is bad for you means it's bad.
I agree it doesn't follow from the meanings of the terms, but my claim is that the fact that something is bad for someone is a bad-making feature, though it can potentially be overridden by other good-making features. So, maybe if something is bad for...
But that's assuming that bad is a sort of a universal statement. You could say, well, if you gain weight and we're in the same ship, then the ship get in the same boat, then the boat is heavier. But I don't see any logical equivalent that says that if things are bad for you, that makes the total amount of badness somehow matter, so it affects me. So I don't see where you're going with this line of argument.
Well, I think we can. So I agree that there is not a proof where you can appeal to self-evident premises and say that something that is bad for someone is bad simplicator. But my claim is that it's obvious, and that and appealing to obvious claims is, unless we have a debunking account, a reason why the obvious claims are not truth tracking. Then if something's really obvious, then we should believe it, I think.
But I don't think it's obvious. There have been lots of people in the world who have been in favor of pain for other people or other bad things happening for other people.
Just as I think there have been people who have, there have been lots of people who have thought lots of very confused things about economics. And I think that in a similar way to the way that we can reflect about morality and come to the conclusion that, and make moral progress, we can, in the same way we can make progress about economics by reflecting on our economic beliefs, by seeing if they're defensible, we can do the same thing about morality. So
with economics, we can either look at logical inconsistencies or we can look at empirical evidence. So economics is really both a logical structure of ideas starting from premises and the attempt to fit that logical structure to the real world by looking at evidence. But I don't see how in the case of morality I can do that.
Well, in morality, you can't do it by looking at the real world. But what you can do is look at very obvious principles. So I'll give you what I think is the best example. You have lots of people who are intuitively average utilitarians, and virtually no one remains an average utilitarian after thinking about it for very long, given that average utilitarianism implies, among other things, that if there are lots of people, if there's one person who's horrifically miserable, if you create a billion more people who are horrifically miserable but slightly more miserable than the current person, that would be a great thing. And that doesn't seem right. And so,
slightly less miserable, you mean?
Yes, yeah, right. And so I think that the same way that we can make progress in economics by appealing to things that are, well, in economics, we have the reliance in the empirical world and on studies. And in philosophy, when it comes to morality, just like in many other areas of philosophy, we can appeal to things that are obvious. We should trust the things that are more obvious over the things that are less obvious.
But it seems to me that what one is actually doing in this is doing intuitionism, not doing logic. That what you're doing is you're saying, it seems to me, if I imagine these two different worlds, the Mead had, I think, the earliest example I know of the sort of debunking of average utilitarianism, where he's imagining two different cities, both happy, full of nice people. City A is a little happier than city B. There's no serious interaction between them. Would it be a good thing if a plague painlessly killed everybody in city B? That's Mead's counterexample. And the answer is no. I use my moral intuition. I look at those two worlds and I say it doesn't make any sense. Those are happy people in city B. Why it can't make the world better for them to all die off. But I think that depends on my moral intuitions, and I only believe them because I think that I am correctly perceiving a moral reality, not because it follows from logic.
I agree that it does not follow from logic. I don't think that you can prove these things. But if you think that seemings are intellectual appearances, like when it seems to you, the same way that it might seem to you that demand curves are sloping downwards, in that when you think about it, it sort of on an intellectual level appears to you that way.
But it appears to me that way for reasons. It appears to me that way because I can think about how the rational behavior of human beings maximizing their own welfare will tend to lead to that result.
Yes, and in the moral case, it'll also
there are lots of economic propositions that are obvious and false. Right, the world is full of them. The proposition that if France gets better at making things, that'll hurt us because of their competition is obvious. Everybody intuits it. It's the justification for various things, and it's wrong. So the fact that something seems obvious to you isn't a sufficient reason to believe it's true. You have to think through why it feels obvious.
Right, and I think in the moral case, you can also think through why it's obvious. But in the moral case, we don't have as good evidence as we have in the economic case, which is why I think you get more progress in economics. But nonetheless, I think that in the moral case, just like in the economics case, you should accept things that are more obvious rather than less. And so the reason why you believe what you do about the example you gave about if France becomes better at exporting things, it'll be good for us too. The reason you accept that is because you can show that it follows from things that are much more obvious than that, the sort of starting intuition about French, about
you were comparing economics to philosophy. Would you say that philosophy has made any serious progress in, say, the last 2,000 years?
Yes.
If Aristotle or Socrates or some other prominent classical philosopher was confronted by a modern philosopher, would his reaction be, by God, you got it? You know a whole bunch of stuff I didn't know. I have to throw out half the things I knew, and I can now replace them with better things. You think that's the case?
Well, I think maybe it might be that Aristotle would have been dogmatic, but I think that if you actually just compare modern philosophy to philosophy 2,000 years ago, I think modern philosophy is much, much better. I mean, here, one example for
there's certainly more pages of it.
Yeah, well, virtually none of the most of the ancient philosophers thought that slavery was okay. That slavery is wrong is a thing that we've made progress on, that now modern philosophers agree about. Now, you might think that that's because of social conventions, but it seems like
How confident are you that the philosopher 500 years from now won't have decided that, after all, slavery is a good idea after all?
I'm pretty confident. And I mean, and there are examples of things that philosophers are way ahead of the curve on. So it seems like the dominant position among philosophers who have published on the topic is that eating meat, at least in typical conditions, is wrong. And this is a position held by a very small portion of the population. There are positions, I mean, if you just read the ancients, I think that they're mostly unimpressive. If you, for example, I mean, one example.
I wasn't talking about how good the ancients were.
Well, I think that actually philosophy is sort of analogous to economics in that way. If you read most of the ancients who are talking about economics, I think most of them, with perhaps the exception of Ricardo, were relatively unimpressive. Well, no, there are more exceptions than Ricardo. I think, a lot of them were pretty impressive. But if we look at
they're also more recent. They're much more recent than the ancients. But,
yes, right.
But
I mean, my favorite example of this is I think Socrates proposed that the virtuous king would be exactly, I don't remember the number, but something like 720 times happier than the vicious despot. Now, the idea that you can figure out from first principles exactly how much happier a person will be by being virtuous than by being vicious is something that's so obviously wrong that no modern philosopher would believe it.
I'd have to look at the passage to know. My guess is that he did not intend it literally, but I don't know the passage. But I would have said that similarly, Rawls' argument for his conclusion is so obviously wrong that no serious ancient philosopher would have taken it seriously, and they'd be right.
Yes, and there are some.
I mean, I'm sure you can find ancient philosophers saying silly things, and you can find modern philosophers saying silly things.
Yes, I think that the percentage of the ancient, if you compare, I mean, so I think Rawls is a bad example because I think what Rawls was embarrassingly bad compared to a lot of the good modern philosophers. But for example, I think there's no ancient philosopher who's anywhere near as good as Michael Huemer.
As
Michael Huemer.
Michael Huemer? Right. Don't know. That is, I haven't read enough of either Michael's stuff or or the ancient philosophers. But it just it when I dip into philosophy, it does not feel to me the way physics does or economics does, as though it's a field in which there's been lots of intellectual progress and we now know things that we didn't know in the past and so forth. It seems to be people who are still making arguments as they were making arguments 2,000 years ago, largely designed to justify whatever they already believed.
I mean, utilitarianism it didn't appear before Bentham. I mean, I think there may have been in ancient China, there may have been some examples of that. So yes. If you look at nearly all the dominant fields, or of the dominant views in normative ethics, they're all relatively new by historical standards. Many of them are a product of the Enlightenment. And the one that is not, which is virtue ethics, I think it's no coincidence that I think virtue ethics is the least good of the bunch as an ethical.
And do you think that if Bentham were around to talk to Aristotle or to Socrates, he would have been able to persuade him?
I don't think so, because I don't think Bentham was very good. But I think that there is a non-trivial probability that Sidgwick would have been able to convince Aristotle or Socrates.
Maybe. I'm not convinced, but you have doubtless spent more time reading philosophers than I have.
But I also don't think that if you went back in time, you would be able to convince Adam Smith that anarcho-capitalism is bad. I think it's just an unfortunate fact of the world.
No, but I could persuade Adam Smith that I think that of what Ricardo in effect was persuading him of, although Smith wasn't around to be persuaded at that point, that Smith's theory of value was incoherent for the reason that Ricardo pointed out, and that therefore you needed something better. And I suspect that I could have persuaded Ricardo quite easily of marginalist economics because he had the sort of first steps. He was responsible for making the first steps on that. There's a reason why we have the term marginal, which came out of Ricardo. So I think there are things that one could, and similarly, I think one could probably persuading Newton of relativistic physics would be hard because you really probably do require some empirical evidence for that one. But anyway, so it does seem to me that in those fields we've really made the kind of unambiguous progress that maybe I'm wrong, but I don't see happening in philosophy.
Well, in philosophy, I mean, I think you wouldn't have been able to convince Aristotle or Kant that utilitarianism was right. But I think yes. If a person went back and talked to Kant, I mean, unless Kant was really dogmatic, I think that they would have been able to convince him that at least some of the things that he said were wrong. For example, that the claim that animals don't matter at all, that was wrong.
You might be able to, but I think I think this would be true of modern philosophers as well. That is to say that each of them, that sort of all of them are, as it were, starting out and making some mistake. They just make different mistakes.
Yes, and I think in a similar way, I think all modern economists are going to be making some mistakes, but they'll
might be, and maybe in another century we'll find out what they are.
Yeah,
that is in a sense that's what Coase is saying. That all modern philosophers, that the modern economists are implicitly working in a zero transaction cost world. That we know we aren't in a zero transaction cost world, and we don't know enough about the technology of transactions to know how to fix it.
Yes. Yeah, I agree with that. My claim is that I think that in the area of philosophy, I think there has not been quite as much progress as there has been in economics. And that's because economics is subject to empirical tests and is subject to the types of more robust proof than philosophy is. But I think that there has been a considerable amount of progress in philosophy. I think if you compare the average ancient philosopher to the average modern philosopher is much better.
But then you get to decide which count as the average modern philosophers. That is, your averaging is going to have to include all of the Rawlsians.
I would submit that even Rawls is better than Aristotle, let's say.
Is he better than Bentham?
I have not read very much Bentham, but I would imagine so.
Is he better than, I'm now forgetting, the person who actually invented the initial position 20 years before Rawls and drew
Harsanyi.
the correct? Yes, is he better than Harsanyi?
I don't think Rawls is better than Harsanyi.
No, he's a big step down from Harsanyi. Harsanyi actually deduces the correct conclusion from his premises, and Rawls doesn't like it. But it's Rawls who is taken seriously by modern philosophers, not Harsanyi.
Yes, I also think that the particular areas of philosophy, some of them I think are kind of joke fields that are not to be taken very seriously. So I think the continental philosophers who, for example, have these gibberish-filled papers that talk where they all seem to have be subjectivists about truth and so on. I don't think that's a very serious field.
But go back for a moment to Aristotle on slavery. Aristotle lived in a society where everybody took it for granted that slavery was all right, and so he thought up arguments for why slavery was all right. Rawls lives in a society in which everybody around him takes it for granted that redistribution from richer to poorer people is right, and so he takes that for granted and then tries to fudge up arguments in order to justify it. It's the same story.
Yes, I agree. I think that in terms of what was around at the time, I think that very often philosophers just attempt to vindicate the societal practices, and I think that's a problem with Rawls and also a problem with Aristotle.
Is it possible that the reason that modern philosophers don't believe in slavery is that conditions changed in such a way that slavery made less sense in modern societies, and so therefore they say obviously it's bad?
Yes.
To take the obvious argument in favor of slavery in classical antiquity, you have wars between city-states. When you win one of those wars, what do you do with the people you've defeated? Well, obvious thing is you kill them off. That way, make sure they aren't going to come back and get after you now, in another 20 years. But if you can sell them as slaves, that's even better than killing them off, and it's also better for them. That would be the argument. That would not, I don't say it's Aristotle's argument, but I'm saying if I were a contemporary of Aristotle's trying to make a utilitarian justification of slavery, that's what it would be. And of course, as an economist, I would say, but the problem with that is that you are making warfare more profitable, and therefore, although it's true you're decreasing the utility cost per war, you're increasing the number of wars.
Yes, I agree that a significant portion of why modern philosophers think the things that they do is because they defend the ensconced practices of the time. But I don't think that that's able to explain all of it. For example, I don't think that that's able to explain why a much larger percentage of philosophers than of the general population thinks that eating meat is severely morally wrong. And I don't think that it's able to explain why lots of philosophers, for example, think that we have very strong obligations to make the future go well, which does not seem to be the dominant belief at the time, or that, as Singer suggested, most people who fail to donate significant portions of their wealth to charity are, in effect, walking past drowning children. And so, and I think that, so I think that.
But that's an argument that's simple enough so you can make it to anybody, and yet people don't find it convincing.
Well, lots of people find it convincing.
Most people don't. Who do you know who is living on the lowest share of his income that would keep him alive and using all the rest to donate to starving people in Africa? I don't even know if Singer is doing it. I don't know about his lifestyle.
So I know a few people like that, but it is a relatively small number. But I know far more people who accept that when they don't donate, when they fail to donate their excess wealth, they are in effect walking past drowning children. And then they're just willing that, if they're willing to walk past drowning children if the alternative is morality being, giving up all their money.
Yeah, but it seems to me you're taking an argument which is so simple that it doesn't really require philosophers to think it up.
Well, I don't know. I mean, the argument had not been seriously thought about until roughly the 1970s.
Do we really know that?
Well, I mean,
I bet you're wrong, but I'd have to go looking.
Well, what I know is that when people make this argument, the citation that they always give is Singer for the first guy who came up with it. I've not in detail examined the previous claim, the previous claims, but One other question to change topics a little bit.
Yeah.
So in your article called The Puzzle of Consciousness, you suggest that there are basically two things that you believe that you cannot fit into a purely physicalist account of the world. One of them is an objective morality, and the other one is consciousness.
Yes.
What would you think about adding? Well, there are a few things that I think maybe we also have to add to this list. One of them is facts about epistemic normativity. So claims that one, in an epistemic sense, should believe things with true premises, such that if an argument has true premises and has a conclusion that follows from the premises, then they are irrational not to believe the conclusion. Now, that's not a claim about the physical world. You can't deduce it from purely descriptive premises, and yet nonetheless, that seems like a true claim. That one who accepts that if P then Q and accepts P is irrational not to believe Q.
It doesn't feel to me like the same kind of puzzle, and I'm not sure I can describe why. It just seems like a sort of obvious in the meaning of the words again.
Well, I don't think it's
I'm willing to consider the possibility that my belief in sort of logic is itself an evolutionary product, but then it seems to be quite likely that in that case it leads to true conclusions, since on the average true conclusions are useful.
Yeah. And what would you make about the idea that mathematics, when you make the claim that I is the square root of -1, or various complicated claims in calculus, you're not making a direct claim about the physical world, nor are you making a claim about either morality or consciousness.
No, but when you say that I is a square root of -1, you're describing an element in a logical structure which can actually be used to say things about the real world.
Well, sure, but I mean, consciousness can be used to say things about the real world, even if consciousness is not a physical thing. Consciousness can be used to say things about the physical world. We can say, for example, that brain regions X, Y, and Z generate consciousness. It seems that the standard for something being physical is not whether it can be used to say some things about the physical world.
No, but my point is not that. My point is that the reason I believe it isn't that. It's that evolution selects for behavior which works in the physical world for evolution's purpose, which is reproductive success, and therefore it is reasonable to suppose that my ways of thinking are at least moderately well adapted to reaching true conclusions about the real world, even if it seems obvious to me, but I'm not sure I know how I justify it, why logic works, why logic is itself a correct way of deducing facts. So you could have an evolutionary or a non-evolutionary explanation for logic.
Yeah, my claim is
the one I believe is the non-evolution, but you could in fact get either one.
Yes, my claim is just that claims about logic are not claims about the physical world. They're claims about all possible worlds. So you're not making a claim that only in the world as it exists, that if you have an argument of the form P, therefore, if P then Q, P therefore Q, no matter what the argument is, even if...
But if there were a world in which it was really in my reproductive evidence not to reach true conclusions, and you could imagine, for example, that I'm a male praying mantis, and my reproductive success happens to get me killed. So in that world, if I were a rational mantis, I would say, anytime you see a female mantis, stay away from her. And if I did that, then being rational would tend to get selected against because I wouldn't have any offspring. So in that world, evolution would not be a reason to think that the way I think gives correct beliefs about the physical world. But in this world, I think there's reason to think that the way I think probably does tend to give correct conclusions about the physical world, even if it didn't seem clear to me that it was sort of logically necessary.
Yeah, well, so I agree with you that logic, like morality, you can tell an evolutionary story about why we would develop it, even if it were not truth tracking. And now I don't think that either of those stories are going to be particularly convincing, but in both cases you can tell some story. My claim is just that not claims about logic, like claims about mathematics and claims about possibility and necessity, and about epistemic rationality. These are not claims about the physical world. So it seems like your ontology cannot just include physical things, consciousness, and morality. It also needs to make way for these other things.
All right, but no, but those are not things that don't fit into my world, whereas consciousness is. That is to say, my picture of the physical world includes logical structures. That's part of how I make sense of the physical world. But that picture of the physical world does not include consciousness, aside from the fact that I happen to know it exists because I directly observe it. And it does not include morality, except to the extent that I directly observe it. They aren't things that sort of fit in with atoms moving around in the world, which is my physical world.
Yeah. So in terms of consciousness, would you
We've been talking so far entirely about my ideas, aside from you're trying to bounce yours off of mine. What are you doing?
So I'm studying philosophy at the University of Michigan.
That's your mistake, right?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, so maybe I'm biased to think that philosophy makes progress, given that. Given that, I'm studying philosophy, and it would be rather embarrassing if I were studying a field where it does not ever make any progress. I'm currently writing a paper in which I argue against desert, against the idea that people deserve things. And the argument it's sort of complicated and would unfortunately take more than 10 minutes to say. So
Is it anything more than the obvious kind of argument which says all of your characteristics are results of things you didn't deserve, such as your genes and your upbringing, and therefore you don't deserve the implications of them?
Yes, it is completely different from that. Actually, maybe I could give a rough sketch of the argument.
Sure.
The basic idea is that, so if you have the following three principles are each plausible if one accepts desert, but are incompatible. The first one is a slight increase in one's virtue does not, from the standpoint of the intrinsic value of virtue, contribute. That's not good to an arbitrarily large degree. Maybe it's good to some degree, but there is a limit to how good it is for a person to be made slightly more virtuous just from the standpoint of virtue. The second principle is if you have two people and that one of them is very virtuous and one of them is very vicious, and they've both suffered a lot, then the marginal badness of extra suffering being inflicted on the one who is more virtuous is greater than the marginal badness of it being inflicted on the one who is more vicious. So it is So if both Hitler and Mother Teresa have been tortured for the last billion years, and you have to force one of them to endure an extra 100 years of suffering, it makes a big difference whether you choose to inflict it on Hitler or Mother Teresa. It's important that you do it on inflict the extra suffering on Hitler rather than Mother Teresa. And the last principle is that making a person who's about to suffer a lot slightly more virtuous is not bad to an arbitrarily large degree. And so each of these is plausible. The second one only if we accept desert, but it turns out they're incompatible. The reason they're incompatible is, so let's say you have someone who's about to suffer a lot, and that they may or may not become more virtuous. Well, if them becoming more virtuous diminishes the badness of all of their suffering, increases the badness of all of their suffering, which it would have to if more virtuous people have worse suffering at the margins from a moral perspective. Then if a person becomes more virtuous, who's about to suffer a lot, that could be bad to an arbitrarily large degree. And because it's not good to an arbitrarily large degree, then a person...
But wait a minute. It seems to me you're confusing bad... How do I want to put it? Bad versus immoral somehow. Let me see if I understand you. We imagine that somebody has been suffering a certain amount, and we now say we make him a little bit more virtuous. And you're saying that's a bad thing because now his suffering counts as more negative.
The suffering he'll have in the future counts as more negative.
But somehow it feels as though you're confusing in your negative how bad something is and how morally wrong it is, so to speak. And those aren't really the same thing. If I think about it as sort of joint libertarian utilitarian point of view, you could have an act which was morally very bad, but had tiny negative consequences, or an act that was morally a little bit bad, but had huge negative consequences. And it seems to me that what's happening when you make him a little more virtuous is not that the negative consequences of his future suffering become larger, but only that the immorality, as it were, of the undeservedness of his future suffering becomes larger.
Yeah, well, so the idea is not, so it's not that it's not about whether it would be wrong for a specific person to cause him to be morally worse. It's about whether, if he became morally worse, just like naturally, after his suffering, if that corrupted him, whether that would be good to an arbitrarily large degree, if he was going to suffer more. And what you seem to suggest is that maybe you have more moral reasons to choose the more vicious person rather than the more virtuous person for the suffering. But it's not like the suffering is differently bad. But it seems like the suffering is differently bad. I mean, if Hitler got kidney stones or died a painful death, it seems like if we believe in desert, we would say that even if no one caused that, that would be less bad than if the most virtuous person ever, say Mother Teresa, got kidney stones.
But again, I think it may be useful to try to look at this through simultaneously a utilitarian and a sort of rights-based kind of lens. Because on the utilitarian lens, it's just as bad when Hitler gets kidney stones as when Mother Teresa gets kidney stones, right? It's the same amount of pain, same amount of disutility, and it's only in terms of justice that one of them is worse, not in terms of how bad it is. And I think somehow I'd have to think about it more, but I think somehow you're mixing those categories.
Well, you seem to be assuming that the kind of basic utilitarian account is the correct account of badness. But
no, it is a possible account, and it seems to me that your moral intuitions are, as it were, blurring the distinction between that account and the justice kind of account that we both to some extent believe in both, as I've argued before. In any case, however, I'm supposed to be picking up my grandson at 2:30, so I think we'd better terminate at this point, and I will leave you to the pains and pleasures of studying philosophy.
All right. Well, thanks so much for appearing, and thanks so much for watching, everyone.
Thank you.
This was a lot of fun.
Thank you, Bad. Bye-bye.
All right. Bye.